Grateful to everybody for dialing in at 9 in the morning. I hope it feels like a good time to you. As I said last week, I do like the 9 a.m. conversation, so I'm feeling good about it. Would you believe that we have had all of these meetings, and I reflected as I sat on us, whether we're in person or doing it virtually, and because I was reflecting this morning on my drive to Lansing on how much progress we've made and what we are actually going to tackle in terms of the phases in our work today. So we've had the work group conversations, we've had the grounding conversations, we've had the report outs from the work groups. Now we get to really start to tackle and put together the recommendations that we've heard. So that progress is pretty impressive, and even more so when you think about it in that virtual space. So grateful to all of you for the time and commitment you've put into this. Super grateful to the work group co-chairs, to the folks that participate in the work group, to our GPI support, and of course to the Eagle support, Kimber and James and Jamie, and it's just pretty incredible what everybody's put together. So now we embark on the next part of our journey. So first we're going to do attendance, and we'll do a little bit of business up front as usual. And then what I'd like to do is ground us a bit in what we're going to embark upon today and how it takes us through the next few meetings to get us to a document that we're working on together. So first let's do attendance, and Kimber's got us set up to be top of the alphabet to the bottom of the alphabet this time. So I'm just warning everyone, it's okay if Ron Vogelweed joins us a minute late because he's going to be down at the bottom. Sorry, Ron.
I'm here today.
Oh, sorry.
Wonders never cease.
You knew that was going to happen. Well, we're glad you're here. Okay, so anyway, Ron's here. Check. Let's see. We'll go with Paul Adjaba. I think I saw Niles, and Niles' last name is an A too, so he fits right at the top of the list. So.
Yeah, it's been convenient. This is Niles. I'm here this morning.
Frank Beaver, who's right on the front of my screen. Good morning, Frank. Nice to see you. Director Corbin from Leo, but we might have Judd. Anybody from Leo? All right, Leo folks, I'm texting the Leo folks. Now they're going to get a cranky text that they're not on the call. Mary Draves. Okay, I think I heard somebody say Mary might be late. So let's see. Carrie Dugan. I think I saw Carrie. There's Carrie.
Morning.
Sometimes I switch buttons and everybody moves around, and then it's like, this game of, okay, where'd Carrie go? Okay, Director Eichinger from DNR, or maybe Scott Whitcomb. Nope. All right. It's 9 o'clock slot. I'm telling you, maybe it's not good for people. Treasurer Eubanks. Somebody from Treasury.
Larry Steckelberg here, but.
Oh, there's Larry. Hi, Larry. Great. Larry likes the 9 o'clock slot. I know that about him. Jim Harrison.
Good morning.
Morning, Jim. From DHHS, Director Hertaler, Megan Groen.
Good morning. Megan's here.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thank Director Corbin. Thank you, Susan. Nice to see you. I was just saying that I was texting Jonathan. I was going to text Jonathan. You're on mute, but I know that it was really nice to see you last night, although we didn't get to say hi in person. So yeah. Great. Let's see. I lost track. Oh, Brandon. I saw Brandon. Brandon, are those new glasses?
They're not new glasses. I just don't always wear them.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thought maybe we just don't see each other in person, so I didn't know you had new glasses. Okay. Marnice Jackson. Marnice, you're with us? All right, she might have been late too. MDAR, Director McDowell or Joseph Rivet? I think I might have seen Joseph. Looking dapper there, chiming in from Bay City quietly.
Thank you. Here, thanks.
Excellent. Phyllis Meadows? Phyllis, okay. I'm sure she'll be with us shortly. Friends from MEDC, Quentin Messer or perhaps Steve Bacall. I think Quentin wasn't able to join us this morning, and I thought he was sending someone. He and I have some time to talk about this, I think next week. So, okay. I think I see Pack.
Yes, you do. Hi.
I think I saw Tanya Pazlowski. I just like to say your name, Tanya. Pazlowski.
It is particularly fun. Good morning, everybody.
Pazlowski, I like it. Cynthia Render Williams was on the phone. Good morning, Cynthia.
Good morning.
Morning. Phil Roos.
Good morning, I'm here.
Darrell. Oh, I skipped Dan. Sorry. Chair Scripps. I saw
I'm
him.
here.
Okay. Darrell.
Hey, good morning.
Getting ahead of myself. Sorry. It's just nice to see everybody. Sam Stolper. Or Sam. There's Sam. Hi, Sam. Yes.
Hi.
1 moment.
Sorry, I was muted first. I wasn't prepared to unmute.
I hear you. I have the same problem. And then we know Ron's here, so. Hey, Ron. Thank you. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. We're going to get our minutes and agenda in front of us. So the agenda for today is to talk about the recommendations and talk about the audience. And I flip-flop this a little bit to have us talk a bit about the audience first, because I felt like it was helpful for us to ground ourselves in what it is that we're delivering. And so while, of course, the ultimate audience, well, let me say that differently. We are delivering a plan to the governor that will come from Eagle. However, I think of the ultimate audience, frankly, as being the residents of Michigan. And so we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how that fits into how we should think about delivering the recommendations. And so I'm going to suggest that what you have in front of you actually flip-flops a little, because I think it helps us, as we've talked about and received recommendations over the last 5 sessions, I think it helps us to build a little bit of context before we get into kind of deliberating the recommendations. So that's what you've got in front of you. And I just broke my own rule of trying to keep the discussion for the discussion part of the Robert's Rules of Order. But if I could have a motion in a second for the agenda, that'd be great.
So moved.
Second.
Thanks, Brandon. Okay, any discussion on that discussion that I just did? All right, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, agenda's in front of us. So let's do the meeting minutes. You've received the minutes from our 23rd meeting. Were there any changes or improvements to those draft minutes that we can make? Great. Let's go ahead and put those in front of us. Thank you to the team that puts the minutes together. Kimber works with Darrell, and so I'm grateful for that consistency and helping us be transparent about our work. So a motion and a second on the meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion on the meeting minutes? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? Thank you. Okay, so for today, Kimber, if you could put the slides up, that'd be lovely. What I wanted to do before I hand it off to Doug to take us through some of our discussion was just to set up where we are. And as we set into this next step, oh, I see Mary. Hi, Mary. No
Hi.
problem. Late. Thanks for joining us. As we set up what we're doing. So I was talking with Doug about it, and he calls it the You Are Here. So I threw in a You Are Here slide. So this is where we are. So I wanted to start by just recapping the executive order, which we did a couple of meetings ago, but I just wanted to put it in front of us again. So obviously this is an advisory capacity to the governor and the department. So you all are advising us in formulating and then overseeing the implementation of the My Healthy Climate Plan. So we're thinking quite a bit about, as we work through the planning effort together, what then takes us into that implementation phase in 2022. So you're going to hear pieces of that as we talk a bit today, and just know that there's more of that, the duck feet paddling furiously under the water, but you're going to start to hear more of that implementation conversation as we move further. Of course, we're working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do our transition towards carbon-wide neutrality. So the couple of bullets that direct us: identifying the recommendations and opportunities for the development and effective implementation of emissions reduction strategies. So again, getting to that next step of implementation as we're working through wrapping up recommendations. And then making sure that what we do, and I like to think of it as floats all boats. So making sure that we really do have an eye towards equity in everything that we're doing with the recommendations. So, again, from a timeline perspective, we'll be receiving continued comment from all of you, as well as through listening sessions. And James is going to talk a little bit in just a moment about the listening sessions that we've held for the public. but I wanted to just kind of set our targets. We've got this discussion today with the listening sessions this week, the discussion today. Our goal is to get a rough outline in front of you for December 14th, as well as a year-end status report to the governor. And then we'll have a plan that we'll discuss together in January. So we've been listening all along for sure. And, we'll do a lot of listening again today as we pull those pieces together, knowing that we're built on the foundation of the discussions that we've been having together, the work groups, the discussions that have been having up through the work groups. But I just wanted to kind of lay out where we're at now and how we are moving it forward. So I'm going to hand it to James to talk a little bit about the listening sessions over the last couple of days, and then he's going to hand it back to me to talk a little bit more about how these pieces wrap together into the plan before we hand it over to Doug. So with that, I'll hand it off to James for a moment.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'm just going to give you kind of a rough outline of kind of what had happened over the last couple of days during our listening sessions, and we'll probably send these notes to you because they have a little bit more detail, but really positive overall. We had over 150 people attend the 2 listening sessions this week. We heard comments from over 65 of them. Really engaged in the topic, really appreciative of the work that the council is doing and the state is doing. And I'm just going to tick off some of the topics that were raised by multiple commenters. Obviously, environmental justice and equity was a pretty, repeated topic, making sure that we're not leaving people behind, making sure that we're addressing communities that have been feeling the impacts. And we have talked about this through our work. A fair number of physicians and clinicians and nurses talking about the public health aspects of climate, and kind of applauding the fact that that was kind of front and center in some of our work. I would say that transportation and mobility was a very kind of high priority topic. A lot of people saying this is the topic we should be leading with. They liked the comprehensive transit plan, a lot of talk about public transit, making sure that we don't only talk about electric vehicles and make sure that we're looking at other modes of operations, and a number of plugs for EV charging stations. A fair amount of commentary about education and the need to educate kind of the public at all levels. We had everything from high school students to seniors. Talking about the importance of kind of engaging more people in this work, and even to the point of putting climate issues in school curriculum and things like that. On that point, I'll note that Eagle just hired a new environmental educator to be working on that with us. So it's an area that we'll be looking at. A lot of discussion on renewable energy, making it widely available to residents across the state. A couple of commenters on the topic that we added on the circular economy, the need for more recycling centers and support for those centers. A couple of issues that we had got into in a little bit of the detail, talking about zoning reform, and basically reformulating cities or allowing cities to reformulate based on new transportation, modes of transportations, and maybe starting to think about that lower reliance on vehicles and how that might work. Fair amount of workforce development, job training, making sure that we're kind of making opportunities for Michigan residents as we moved forward. A lot of talk about 2050 is not soon enough. They wanted us to go much faster, and including, incentives in the plan to make that happen. A number of other just kind of one-off issues, but as I said, we will share the notes with you, but overall, very positive, no kind of negative comments whatsoever over the 4 hours of listening session. So we thought that was really positive. Back to you, Lisa.
Awesome. Thank you, James. So, I heard a lot in listening to the discussion about that education component. And I think a lot about taking everybody with us, so to speak, and how do different audiences hear what it is that we're talking about. And so I do think that education component is really critical. I think the public health component is critical. And then, for me, pace always makes me anxious because I think a lot about the speed with which we need to do some of this work balanced out with, you know, the challenges that come from the speed as well, right? So there's always, it's always the balance of, you know, that deployment with the cost and the economic side of it. So anyway, all right, well, this is, I think, a really good table setting for our discussion through the recommendations here today. So I just wanted to share a bit, you know, you heard from the comments, that component of public health and that component of how do we take others along with us, and what does that implementation look like? I think one of the other things that as we're crafting the plan from the department perspective, we are working to accomplish the goal of the deliverable to the governor and then building up for implementation in 2022. A couple of things I want to mention about that. The first is that we're going to work in a lot of metrics, emissions, et cetera, that we have, those types of numbers that we've got through the resources that we have now. We are anticipating having more of those kind of resources in 2022. So we're bringing a modeler on staff and doing that type of work so that we're going to have even more enhanced data. So I think that, you know, this plan is going to look more at a high level in terms of execution. So my engineering friends that are going to look to take each recommendation, figure it out by emissions reductions profile over the course of 5 years versus a 10-year duration and get it all to zero. That's unlikely to be the outcome of this report. So I just want to kind of set the table. There's going to be additional opportunities for modeling and modeling work going forward through the implementation phases, and we're going to have a lot of that that's a component of this. But I just want to, again, sort of set the table for what we're, how we're thinking about what this looks like. So that analytical capacity, I think, will be really helpful. You know, we also see this document really as being a living, breathing document. So we're fully expecting to work with all of you in 2022. I don't know what the rhythm of those meetings are going to look like yet. I think it'll kind of play out early in the year as we think through what does the implementation effort look like, what do those teams look like in 2022, and that will be only enhanced by the work with the council. I also think a lot about how a plan is great and the pieces that happen in state government are great. However, so much is happening in the private sector and frankly on the ground, frontline, in communities. And so that education component when it comes to bringing more people in the tent, but also leaning on the work that is already happening is a really necessary piece of what we do going forward. So, you know, that obviously actions taken by the state of Michigan are important. And as we've articulated a couple of times, we're anticipating laying out in the recommendations, you know, what needs to happen at the legislature, what needs to happen, what can happen through executive action. But there's so much that happens through the private sector. We really see this as being a partnership going forward. And I've been thinking a bit about, you know, how does that play out in the course of delivering the plan in early 2022, because so much is happening in other places than state government. But that being said, policy does matter, and setting the right policies has an impact on, you know, what does that clean energy economy look like for us. So hoping that this gives you some insight as we're thinking through how to get an outline in front of you and then get us to our January goal of a plan. I'm going to take it now, and actually I can stop and see if there's any questions for me before I hand it off to Doug to help us think a bit through what does that audience and the goals look like as we work into talking through key work group recommendations. I will say one of the other things that Doug has said, I'm quoting Doug a lot today, well done, Doug, is this concept of the Russian nesting dolls as we think through the plan. So there are going to be, you know, kind of the body of the plan, which I can't remember how James said it yesterday, policy wonks who read this stuff in the middle of the night, which is James, will be interested in what that plan, like all the details, appendixes and materials there. But there's also going to need to be, you know, an executive summary that wraps it up, and frankly, like a 1 or a 2 pager that sits on top of it. So we're thinking about Russian nesting dolls, or sort of that pyramid approach to what are really the lead goals? What do we sum up to, and then how do we execute it through all those steps that support? So that's a lot for me. I'm going to stop for a second, see if there's questions for me, or we'll hand it to Doug and get into discussions so that we can hear your input as we're thinking through how to build this. All right, Carrie.
Yeah, that was super great to hear the feedback that you were getting. I think the one thing that really stood out to me around the educating the public piece is that's kind of missed in the rest of this is really the competitive advantage that Michigan has relative to other states. And really, I know Quentin's not on, I don't know who's on from MEDC, but really thinking through how that ties to how we talk about our state from a business attraction, site selection perspective. I think building up our confidence, particularly with our young people and wanting them to stay or boomerang back like some of us have done, will be something I'll be kind of looking for, because I can say with confidence there's more than one of us on this call that chose to move to Michigan for climate reasons. And so I want that to be part of the story here.
Love it. That's a great point, Carrie. Thank you. And I totally agree. Okay, I think I'm going to hand it to Doug.
Yeah, and Carrie, that was a great, thanks, Director, and that was a great way to start, because that's exactly the kind of thing that we wanted to think about here for the next few minutes. So, as the Director said, how do we talk about this? What are the resources that the people? We've got a wide and diverse set of networks between all the council members that we operate in. What are people going to need to be able to not understand it, but to feel the importance of it and to come along, with what the plan is trying to do. So, are there myths that we need to address as part of this, as we decide how we want to talk about it? How do we talk about the equity and the environmental justice issues, which have been so important to this process? What's the best way to convey that going forward? And what resources will the public need? We talked about the Russian nesting doll approach, and having a lot of analytics and a huge report that we all will read, but probably 99+% of the public won't. So what are the other resources that we can develop, whether that's a 2-pager or a 5-pager, whatever that happens to be, and where are the best ways to try to disseminate? Where are the best places to try to disseminate that operation? So, it's a little more free-form kind of discussion than we normally have, or that we will have, a little bit later today. But you've got such expertise, and you all work in such different networks that it makes sense to us to try to work this out with you and get your thoughts on that as the plan gets developed here. So you guys know the drill by now, and meeting whatever it is, 14 or whatever meeting this is, just use the raise your hand feature, and I'll call on you as I see you. But those are the kinds of questions that we want to explore. And Carrie, what you just said is a perfect example of that. So since I used your name, you can start us off again, Carrie.
Yeah, sorry. Obviously had my coffee and I don't have an ankle biter next to me today. I like 9 a.m. too. So the other sort of point I was thinking at is on the economic development piece. What's in it for me from a community's perspective? Dr. Clark and I have talked about this a bit. Is how do you actually overcome? I'm going to say overcome rather than dispel the myths about things like wind and solar. I did a little work with the National Academies last year in the COVID context. And one of the things I learned is that spending our efforts to dispel myths is actually doubles down and reinforces the false narrative. So I want you to consider that as we go forward is don't bother. We've seen that over the years kind of with wind and how that's been told. And the states, I would spend more time just really, boosting up the confidence of community to take on new opportunities that will in fact have economic benefits for them. So that's one thing I just want to lay on the table right now. I don't see a lot of upside in us spending too much time on myth dispelling.
And Carrie, if I could follow up on that with the economic argument, so would that be different in the ag community than it would be in the industrial community, for example, or different ways to look at it in different places?
Yeah, I think it's place-based, right? And it's got to be I know you guys all share that same ethic. We want it to be driven by the community. So the conversation around DEI and how it relates, I think we have a real opportunity here to take care of our communities and educate them in a way that really speaks to them, depending on what part of the state they fall in and what assets they have. So absolutely.
Great, thank you. That's a great way to lead off. Darrell and then Peck.
Thanks, Doug. I just wanted to make a global point as we're thinking about next year and starting to educate folks about the the eventual My Healthy Climate Plan that's going to come out and the work that we've been doing. I don't know about other council members when I go and talk to folks about this council. I mean, still largely people don't know about the work that we're doing, and so like I think as we're thinking about educating folks about this process, I mean, I think we're gonna even have to think even smaller, even baby steps. I mean, so you already have the challenge of trying to educate folks about climate change and the policies that help us meet those challenges. But this is talk generally about this whole process, which as somebody who's been pretty heavily engaged, I can lose track of some of the parts of it. So, anything that we can do to try to make that process easier. So obviously 2-pagers, even like promotional videos. I don't know what kind of budget there is for things like that, but I think that's really helpful. But I guess a more narrow point I believe Carrie was getting to in terms of meeting folks where they're at, in terms of their community. I think that, as much as that we can do that as we're going around talking to folks about this, I think the better we'll be off there. So obviously, with some of the options, the listening session options, that might have been problematic, especially for folks who don't have the greatest internet service, so thinking of like getting creative and thinking about ways while still respecting and understanding we're still in a pandemic. How can we still make sure that folks who, again, may not have the best internet service can still participate, make sure their voice is heard, but also be educated and have, be able to know enough to be able to chime in. So that's some of my thoughts.
No, that's great. And I think the other point I'd be curious in your reaction to this would be, so people who will proactively go out and join a listening session are different than a lot of the rest of the public too. So how do you get to the folks that won't go out and affirmatively join a listening session to talk about these issues? How do we meet folks, who aren't doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I won't, and I would love to hear other folks' thoughts, but I'd probably some combination of reaching out to grass tops. So those, in certain communities, the local commissioner or local township person is, somebody you could reach out to, and they may help gather folks to elevate, hey, this is an important issue. Actually, I saw this approach done fairly successfully when the previous administration, Governor Snyder, when he had his 21st infrastructure process, they went to different communities, and I think they would reach out to local electeds and help gather an audience to talk about different parts of that work. So, so those are some ideas there. But
great, thanks, Darrell. Peck, and then Phil.
Hey, everybody. I think these are really good comments. And what I'd like to focus on is how do we get early wins and positive feedbacks? And that's sort of a technical term for once you start the ball rolling, how does it roll faster and faster in the direction you want it to roll? And we have a unique opportunity with the bipartisan infrastructure bill and hopefully Build Back Better money coming, but also just support of a governor and a great Eagle team and a lot of others in the state who want to make it happen. And so we got to look at strategically and really lay out when we come to implementation, how do we get that ball rolling downhill rather than uphill? And just to touch first on Carrie's comment, education versus engagement is how I look at it. Environmental education now, or communication, is a very sophisticated field, and the thing that Carrie mentioned is very real. In other words, you can get perverse responses or results if you don't do it right. So we have to be very careful in how we do education. And for example, if Eagle is going to have an education initiative, I think it would be really wise for us to engage with some real experts in that field to make sure we hit it just right. And we use polling numbers and we make our education and communication effort tailor-made for different audiences, because it'll be quite different when you go, say, from rural to urban. Another comment that's been made, I was really happy to hear James mention, the support for mobility, because I think there are two kinds of balls rolling downhill we want. One is going to be in public support space, and the other is going to be in national reputation space. To be able to get to where Carrie was, in other words, we want to make sure that talent, entrepreneurs, anyone wanting to do anything in the clean tech, low carbon world is looking at Michigan as the place to come, because we're out ahead in supporting it. So mobility is the clear winner. I think everyone would agree. We got to really put a lot of juice behind that to ensure that we can continue to claim the lead in that. But another one that we've talked about that was really compelling to me and that could really fit well with Build Back Better is the low carbon, I can't remember what I would call it, but low carbon industrial hub. In other words, we have like our big cement factories, we have our other energy intensive industries that we need to figure out. And rather than saying, like so many people are, is, oh, we'll figure that out last because it's the hardest problem. Let's get out ahead of that, because we are an industrial state. And that's a real advantage if we can convey that we're an industrial state, and because of that, we're gonna tackle these harder problems first, or early on. But I think that is also going to have a positive feedback, and that other folks in this anything industrial manufacturing will be thinking, well, wow, Michigan really is serious about this. Then more on the public support side, a lot of the discussion on equity and justice. Obviously, most of us are thinking about these urban community members and fellow citizens who have just been hammered by the system that was stacked against them through all of time up to now. And I think we really have to show that this transition is not going to be stacked against them. And as Liesl said, will float all boats. But at the same time, we need early wins in the rural space. And I think Carrie, highlighted that too. We've got to really figure out how to get some of our rural communities to really embrace, and we got to figure out how to go the full distance so that we can use them as examples for all the other rural communities where the introduction of mobility, renewable energy, storage, solar as well as wind, the whole gambit has really benefited individuals and communities. Because I think we will win this battle, because economically, this is going to bring money and opportunity into these communities, but politically they don't want to engage in many ways. And the last one I'll mention, and I apologize for just sort of giving a long list, but these are the things that really stood out to me as we went through our process, was this natural carbon solutions. A lot of people are talking about it, but like with the industry problem, can we maybe focus on natural carbon solutions in a more sophisticated way and make Michigan a go-to place for figuring out how to use agricultural practices and forestry land use practices to truly sequester carbon? Because right now, and this is where I think all these things, our universities could help, but we have a real opportunity to do a lot better than other states. And unfortunately for the West, all those states can work in this area, but they're running out of water for agriculture, and they are burning up literally their forests. So they have a much tougher job than we do. So we have to be the ones who sort of show the path forward before we get in the same situation they're in, at least with the wildfires. Thank you.
Director, did you want to jump in on this one before I go to Phil?
Yeah, if you don't mind real quickly, I just wanted to talk, I really appreciate the discussion around how are we engaging with parties across the state. And I just want to mention two things that come to mind as I'm hearing people give us some really good feedback about how to do that. The first is that Eagle will not be able to do this alone. So this is something that I like to use the hub and spoke model, where maybe the plan itself is the hub, and then there's so many spokes that we would be working together and talking about, you know, again, maybe that consistent, like, these are the things we're trying to do, but not everybody talks about all of it. People talk about it in their own voice with the piece that they can be compelling on. So I'm really looking forward. This is great feedback, and I'm looking forward to how do we figure out how to put those hubs and spokes together as we get in, or the hub and spoke together as we get into kind of the next phase. The other thing I would just say quickly is we've built this Catalyst Communities program at Eagle, and the effort there was to think about reaching audiences, again, where they're at. And so we've got a component that's around rural siting and economic development for wind and solar deployment, and that is different than the segment that is about how do you work with communities that are interested in doing resiliency work, thinking through climate, but they don't have anywhere, they don't know where to start. Our communities have lost dollars over the years. We're at a really great opportunity, as people have pointed out, particularly PEC, to put dollars into communities to help them plan, help them have resources. You know, many communities like don't even have a person to be their sustainability manager, their climate manager, or, you know, their energy manager. And so that's kind of our second bucket. How do we help them? How do we give them resources, and how do we show them that they're not alone? Other communities that look like them in Michigan and across the Midwest are trying to do the same things, and that they can partner together to learn. And then the third bucket is frankly the leaders, right? The communities that are out in front, the communities that are doing listening sessions with their communities to talk about what do they want to be, how do they integrate, you know, changes to public transportation into their mobility planning, into their EV charging, into their energy use for their community, for what they're doing at the city, you know, so that's another bucket. So anyway, I just wanted to give a little bit of insight into how do we think about them, and what you're sharing with us right now is super informative to help us improve all of that. So I'm done. Thank you for the moment.
Thanks, Director. Phil, and then Ron.
Yes, thanks. I'm going to try not to be repetitive, but I'm going to build on some themes that Carrie and Peck had. And I'm trying to rough out in my head what's the executive summary of this look like. And I think that's really important. I've been worried about and kind of focused on the narrative. And I think that sort of the headline I'd have on that is, can we make this a completely Michigan-specific, Michigan kind of branded plan that is all about, yes, it's about carbon reduction, decarbonization, but it's about positioning us as sort of the leaders in the decarbonized economy. And let me just be as bold as to say, it's a climate refuge. This is a place where people should come because we're going to be well positioned for that. So I'm just thinking about the elements of this. It feels like we need some, even though we don't have everything modeled, and we're probably more focused on 2030 and 2035, or maybe even shorter term than that. It seems like we need a few big goals, and I don't know how to do this, Lisa, with your comment about we may not have the modeling until next year, but I don't see how we don't have 2 or 3 big emission reduction goals, even if they're short-term in nature in there. But we also have some very specific kind of first steps in terms of goals toward positioning Michigan, you know, as a leader in all this area. And then if you think about the big strategies, could they be all Michigan-based? Yes, there's basics like clean up the grid, but a number of them that are economic development oriented, that are, probably particularly the two that you mentioned, Peck, in the, being a leader in electric vehicles and the low carbon industrial hub and things like that. I'm getting into initiatives here, but sort of a strategy about picking some areas where we can lead in the decarbonized economy. And then there's a big focus on how do we translate this to communities, the environmental justice element, and then I think like way of life. And this is where about clean water and all the natural working land stuff, really building that in there. If you had those, 3 or 4 elements, and then we just have 1 or 2 animating big initiatives under each of those that we can begin work on right away. And I won't repeat what's already been said. Peck had a good list of those. But anyway, that's sort of my headline. Why don't we just frame the whole thing around leader in this new economy and a refuge in a changing climate.
Thanks, Phil. To your point about the kind of what's the stuff that has to happen, the big reductions, and then what do we do first? Hold that thought, because that's how we want to frame the next part of the discussion when we look at the recommendations going forward. So that will be a perfect lead into that. So thanks, Phil. Ron.
Sure, thanks. And I do really appreciate all the different comments, especially Peck there. That was a pretty exhaustive list. Pretty awesome to follow up on. I would challenge just a few things here on, we talk about communities, we talk about rural versus urban. We really have to, we talk about executive summaries. How do we make personal summaries? How do we bring persona? How do we bring people to the forefront? How do we talk about strong versus a refuge? How do we talk about catalyzing? How do we catalyze a person? What is that personal connection to this plan? And I think we all are talking about that in narrative, and I think it is a part of that, but how do we get it down to what is that advantage for them? How does that create a vibrant, not just resilient Michigan? I think we kind of bring a little bit of a negative connotation along with some of these plans that brings in that negativity. It's about less, it's about what we're going to reduce, not what we're going to grow, what we're going to do. So I agree with the quick wins, though. I think this is the prioritization. I think we've got to get to the community level, but really down to the individual level in some sense to use that in good branding work. And I'm not the marketing person at Whirlpool, trust me. But I did stay at a Holiday Inn, so maybe I'll just do it anyway. But this idea, we use personas all the time. What is that representative person? How can they connect and see parts of themselves in the plan? And I think that may be, and I think bringing in the experts, not myself, and I'm sure some of us on here, how do you connect that? And I think as we go through some of these plans too, that intersectionality, showing how they're connected and how that makes a better plan or accelerates the work. Giving them some view of what that future looks like too. I think while we get into the wins, we can get lost in this piece, this next piece, and then I think Daryl said it best. It starts to become a collection of lots of things that just get confusing. You go through a 1,000-page bill, right? And there's like all these little things. There's money going here and there, and sometimes you lose track of what it is. It's just a fundamental investment in an infrastructure. How do we get back to that kind of language too? So it's hard. You got to go way in and then come essentially pull the rubber band all the way back. So, and I think we got some really key ones in there that in those recommendation sheets, and I know we're kind of delaying getting to that, so I'll kind of shut up now. But how do we do that on a fundamental scale? And I think you're right, Phil, with this Michigan. It is uniquely present in, and I'll just give you, with ours, carbon offsets, things like that, people were talking about, but what about investment in Michigan where we have those assets and the ability to do those natural, and I think Peck said it too, those NCS that are great opportunities for companies like ours to invest in here. So I think, there's some outreach that could happen and some progress to be made. So I'll stop there with my ramblings, but I think just some challenges for us to communicate that plan, less than a headline, but
Thanks, Ron. Joseph, Rivet, and then Brandon.
I just wanted to circle back a little bit on the audience conversation. James indicated there weren't a lot of negative comments. I've been a local government guy for 25 years, right? And maybe we need to think about outside the box focus groups. I know in Bay County, if I want to know what's going on, you go to the coffee club, Linwood Corners in Linwood, Michigan, and they tell you what's going on. You want to know what they'll swallow in the ag community? It's Kenny Vandenboom's barn during the non-growing season, because those guys all get together, start drinking beer around 10:30 in the morning, right? So I guess my point is that at some point, when this is released and we know there might be some voices of concern, we can potentially mitigate that if we think about ways to actually go out into the community on the ground, which is, where I've spent 25 years of my career, because that's where you really listen to the people. Not, the listening sessions are one thing, but there has to be some sort of clever mechanisms to go out and find focus groups, people who are really out there. And that's always been helpful in my formation of public policy. Thanks.
Thanks, Joseph. Brandon, and then Jim Harrison.
Yeah, appreciate the conversation. I'll, like Phil, try not to be repetitive. I wanted to, Joe just said a lot of what I had to say, that, when it comes to community outreach, I do think we should have a stakeholder engagement plan that meets people where they are, not just invites folks that might be self-selecting, who are interested in this topic already. I think to make the resilient stakeholder engagement and truly listen, I think we're going to have to go out and find, whether that's local chambers, Rotary clubs, Optimist clubs, places like that, and do some of that work and talk about this issue in kind of kitchen table terms, not in climate policy long terms. What does it mean for jobs? What does it mean for energy bills? What does it mean for reliability and resiliency? And I think that's the other kind of broader theme I just wanted to bring out. A lot of our focus thus far has been in the mitigation space, which is appropriate, given the governor's net zero goal. But I wonder what the role for discussion about climate resiliency and infrastructure investment, what we need to say in this report in that regard. And I like the notion of celebrating Michigan as Phil put it, a climate refuge and a terrific place to be, not just for the clean energy economy, but as an attractive place to live, to raise a family, to grow business, et cetera, in this century of a changing climate. And so it almost feels like that's a whole separate theme that we might not have spent as much time fleshing out because we've been so focused on the emissions reductions, that it might be worth putting some thought into as we begin these conversations, or maybe it's something for next year. I fundamentally believe that there is a ton of economic opportunity with the clean energy transformation, and that can be a real opportunity. But having done this in prior administrations, I also would just caution to be careful about not overselling that, and overestimating some of the transition costs and the both to communities and to potential increased cost in energy bills and in other things. I think if you're too rosy that this is all rainbows and unicorns and economic growth, you can lose people on that. And so I do think there's a tremendous opportunity, but we got to be balanced in how we approach that so that we can bring everybody along. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Brandon. And I'm assuming, just following up on when you're talking about going out to the different places and talking, that's different messengers. It's not necessarily the same road crew that's doing all of that. You're using different messengers in different places.
Agree.
Jim.
Well, Doug, Brandon just shortened my comments by quite a bit, and I will, particularly in the economic growth. I think that's his point there is critically important. I believe this is an opportunity for Michigan to continue to build on its strengths, use this as energy transition and its climate goal transition as an opportunity for economic growth, but we need to be very level-headed about that and not overpromise that just like Brandon says. This is repetitive, but I'm saying this in a repetitive manner because I think it is important that developing a narrative and going out and targeting constituencies that are really important that have not had the opportunity to participate in the focus groups. I know it's kind of like continue to hit that hammer on the nail, but I think it's really important. And out of that, then, I think it's important then to develop some message testing prior to doing any kind of narrative, prior to doing any kind of 2-page summary, that some kind of message testing is done so that we come out on a positive communication. I think Carrie's point on not focusing on myth busting is really important because that puts the message testing on a defensive. I think it's really important to talk about, what messages resonates for the different constituencies of the citizens of the state and the different communities of the citizens of the state, including across the spectrum of the recommendations themselves, because everybody has a little bit different viewpoint in relation to that. I think the idea of private sector partnerships that Director Clark spoke about, I think is really smart, and particularly with message testing initially, as well as opportunity for some quick hits out the door on those manufacturing, industrial, and technology, advanced technological kinds of aspects that we're trying to attract in the state, maintain in the state, and grow jobs in. I think as we're talking to I don't care what kind of community it is, whether it's an urban community, rural, suburban, that if we're talking about job growth and workforce development, we ought to be able to then articulate to people how they are going to have access to these jobs. And that, we start thinking about, and this may be a further initiative, but we start thinking now about, what kind of access, what kind of credentialing is necessary, how the state can maybe bring a whole of government approach to both workforce development, as well as the very important aspect that Director Clark made, based on my experience in working in communities that have been subject to plant closures across the country and what happens to those communities, and the defunding of all communities in general, that communities really need, they don't have the opportunity to do any kind of planning. And Director Clark was right, I think really hitting a poignant part here that is like a parallel track, I think, that communities having access to resources or having like a one-stop shop kind of opportunity, or understand what some best practices are or learnings from other communities, I think is really important. The work that the state's doing right now with some of the downriver communities itself, the initial conversation with those community leaders were like, I'd love to be able to do some of this stuff, but we just don't have the resources anymore. And that's, that's not just in Michigan, that's across the country itself. So I really do think that that's an opportunity that if the state can't bring direct resources, that opportunity to at least convene or to provide some kind of connection for communities to be able to do that. And I think, I think at that point, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Pretty good theme here of also being honest about what the benefits are and not underselling where the challenges are, which I think is, I'm hearing that loud and clear over and over from the group. So thanks, Jim. Sam.
Thanks, Doug. I don't consider myself an expert on communication translation, especially to a really broad audience. So I'm starting there to say I defer to other folks who I think are wiser in this regard. I have more experience, and I'm enjoying hearing everybody's comments. My one comment here is something that I think said in the survey, my survey responses to individual work group recommendations, and maybe is something that I brought up once out loud in one of these meetings. Given where we are in the time frame, we've put a ton of work into the recommendations. We're not fundamentally overhauling them or anything, but I've always been myself a little uncomfortable or maybe dissatisfied with certain of the key action verbs that are sometimes used in the recommendations. And I think this grid, this 5x5, 5x6 grid, helps me take catalog that. Verbs like study and consider and explore and investigate. I assume, especially since a lot of the community around me that I hear from tends to have more aggressive hopes for, a faster time frame that they expect. And those words, I suspect, will be frustrating to that sort of community. I don't mean to say that we're done studying and exploring. We're in different parts of the timeline with developing all these different policy ideas and technologies, et cetera. But I'm just highlighting that I think we should be careful, and where there's opportunity to rephrase such that it doesn't make people think, hey, that was your job to study and consider, and now you're telling us that the recommendation is to study and consider. That seems like a potentially value-added set of edits to make.
Great. Ron, your hand is still up. Was that up from before or? Okay, good. We let that go a little longer than we had originally planned, but I thought it was pretty valuable to hear all the comments that people had. So let me just take one last swing and see if anybody has a comment they don't think has been made yet. Lee, Andre?
Yeah, I had a comment about messaging. There's an example in the legislature for the community solar bill. And I think a lot of people view that as urban people, apartment dwellers, houses with too many trees. And the community solar bill could really be transitioned to a business arrangement if we knew how to connect to rural substations. There's lots of co-benefits by having distributed power. And if we message the community solar to industrial parks, the original bill last year had 10 participants as a limit. If we went to the industrial parks and said, hey, there's 10 businesses here, do you guys want to go together on a community solar bill? You could go out in the rural areas and find 10 farmers who had a piece of land that was particularly a good advantage for solar. And those 10 farmers could go together on a community solar bill. That bill, it reminds me of the fact that consumers have once said they wanted 6,000 megawatts of power. And at 5 megawatts each, which is the limit for the community solar, it would take 1,200 locations. And there are 1,200 townships in this state, or 1,240 townships in the state. If we could get some transparency from the power company to say every rural substation is an opportunity to put in a community solar project, all we have to do is find the perfect spot near that substation. I think a lot of businessmen would start to see the community solar project as a business opportunity, not a residential opportunity.
Hey, thanks, Lee. I'm gonna just step in here and remind us that we have opportunities for public comment through the listening sessions and then through email, and we'll set up some other conversations like that. So appreciate the input. We're gonna keep the discussion for the rest of the session to council members, but appreciate that. So thanks.
Thanks, Lee. So Director, do you want to kind of tee up the chart that Sam mentioned, the 5x6 chart there?
Yeah, for sure. So some of you have seen this already. What we attempted to do was put everything on one piece of paper. Oh my goodness, how hard is that? And so as James has said a couple of times in our internal conversations about this, some of these are incredible simplifications. As you all know, when we heard from just, for example, the energy group that, they felt like their couple of pages of summaries were very abbreviated versions of not only the policy, but also the discussions that had happened in the work group. So now we've abbreviated even further. So the first thing I'm going to say is apologies for places where, the abbreviation might not translate correctly. So we're obviously always interested in that feedback and, Sam's comments about action verbs is an important one. So what we were hoping was to get into a discussion around these recommendations. You all have started some of this in the course of the conversation about how are we communicating, and what really are we communicating with the recommendations and with the plan. I just want to say, I am cognizant of the verb discussion and the desire for action, et cetera. And as I said early in my opening comments, you will find me pretty passionate about timeline and about what we're doing. I think the other trick is just knowing who can do what, right? And so who has the ability to take the different steps. And that is one of the reasons that I thought it was important for us to talk about audience, because at the end of the day, policy matters, the action of policymakers matters, the actions of the private sector matter, and the action of individuals matter. And so, when I think about Sam's point about action and about who's taking it and about what we're doing, I think about that and about the kind of direction to those that are taking the action. So anyway, sort of a disjointed setup, but has everyone seen the kind of grid that Sam was referring to? Okay, great.
Is it, should we put it up on the screen? I don't know how well it'll translate font wise to the,
for those of us that need to really stare, and I've tried
as a guy of a certain
every
age,
mode how to
I'm
make
wondering
stuff
about reading
bigger,
it.
but
Yeah. So let me, should we at least try it though?
yeah, I think Kimber had put it up for some of the listening sessions. So Kimber, if you don't mind putting it up, that would be awesome. I can't remember if you put it in a slide or.
I did. I can do that.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Kimber. And again, so the idea that we want to do for the next 50 minutes or so is kind of think about it in recognizing all of the caveats that the director said, but talk about it in terms of, what are the ones on here that I think it was to Phil's point during the last discussion, you have to have some big reductions or else this doesn't work. You don't decarbonize without it. But also the things that, what are some of the things that have to happen first? What are some of the things that we will need to do first as we go through here? So we can take it by buckets, or I don't.
Actually, I'm sorry. Can I step in real quick before we get into this too?
Sure.
I should mention that you've seen a couple of comments from Susan Corbin, who's the director of Leo, in the chat. We've got Treasurer Eubanks on, and Larry Stuckelberg, who's been here from Treasury all along. There are programs that are happening at the state. The ETIP one that Jim Harrison mentioned in reference in his comments about, work that's happening for some of the downriver communities that is being guided by Treasury, workforce efforts like the Electric Vehicle Academy or the Battery Academy that was just developed or announced a couple of weeks ago. All of that. I'm so pleased and appreciative of my fellow cabinet members, because them hearing you say all of this helps us then take it back and tie it together. So that, first, we're better talking about what the state's already doing, but most importantly, we're getting better feedback about how to do more reaching communities where they're at, make it more of a one-stop shop, and have that connective tissue around climate so that it is more compelling. So anyway, I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention that because I have appreciated the directors being involved and being part of the discussion. I just wanted to point that out before we get into recommendations.
No, it's great. And it also goes to the point you made earlier that lots is already happening. It's not that you're starting from scratch. There's a lot that's already going on. So that's an important piece of this as well. Director, is it okay if we just talk about it in terms of the whole chart, not go by buckets? Because I think that would probably be better in terms of just getting folks' thoughts on what are the big items and what are the things that has to happen first across all 28 of these that are on here.
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay, so let's do it from that standpoint. So what are the big things? What are the things that have to happen? What are the things that should happen first? If you want to add in what's already happening, something to build on, that would be great too. So Phil, you get to start us off.
Yeah, sorry, this is a sort of a general comment. I think what I would I think it'd be really helpful is to take each of these areas and write one overarching statement of our strategy that is Michigan specific. So I was starting to try to word those here, but I won't try to provide narrative here on the fly. But as an example, under transportation mobility, it might be, leverage, capitalize on Michigan's, automotive leadership to become the leader in electric vehicles and blah, blah, blah. And then have all the other more specific, and these are still pretty high level recommendations fall under them. But anyway, that's what I'm sort of yearning for is 5 big, one for each work group, overall Michigan specific sort of leadership strategies that are kind of the thing somebody would remember, and then everything else under it's kind of a more specific initiative. Just a thought.
So a way to look at transportation and mobility and a way to view all of the recommendations that come underneath it. It's kind of an umbrella comment about each. Okay. Thanks, Phil. Darrell.
Thanks, Doug. I just have a process question. I guess in terms, so obviously the different work group chairs, they selected their top 5 recommendations, but obviously they have more than just those 5 recommendations. So, is the thought is that we're we're just looking at just the 5 that were submitted and, consideration for those other potential recommendations are just kind of put to the side, or is there like a plan for how to, there are other recommendations to consider later on? If there's any thoughts there?
I think the short answer is no, Darrell. I think all of the recommendations will be part of what Eagle considers as they put together the plan. They were just looking at it in terms of the top recommendations that each work group submitted in terms of what do we look at now in terms of the biggest items and what comes first. But I think, and Director or James, correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously Eagle is going to be considering all of the recommendations that came from the work groups as it puts together the plan. Doesn't mean that they'll all show up in the same way, right. Because this is advisory to Eagle's process, but certainly considering all of them is the goal. Director, did you want to add to that?
No, I don't. And unless anyone wants me to clarify further, I thought that was well said.
Thanks. All right. Well, let me prompt it then. We started transportation mobility came up. So let's look at it from that aspect. What in transportation and mobility, taking a look at and recognizing that they are oversimplified given the reports, and there's plenty of material behind the reports to come up with. What are the biggest items to do, and what are the things that have to happen first? What do you want to weigh in on that? Phil and Darrell, I think your hands are still up from before, but I didn't want to exclude you if you.
Sorry.
Director?
I'm going to weigh in. We need charge
sure.
Structure people. And I think that it fits under what we've articulated here. But I do like the coordinated comprehensive plan with transportation and electrification plan. That we need infrastructure, and it's going to be part of the light duty, part of the heavy duty. Yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it at that.
And that's something that could actually start happening right away too, right?
Yeah, I would argue it's something we're already working on.
Already doing, right.
Expanding it with the additional support from the feds. And that's not.
Well, that worked, Director, because we got 4 hands after that. So that's perfect. Jim, you go first.
So I would support that. I would think that recommendation number 1 would be first and foremost, and I would think then that would then become dovetailed with recommendation number 2, which is an incentive, right? I mean, you got to be able to build the demand for the supply that you are, and there's lots of stuff potentially coming out of the federal government that may actually help both of those, right? Recommendation 1 and 2.
Right.
And then I mean, to me, this is kind of like, already in my mind anyhow, laid out in a chronological order kind of thing. There's definitely overlaps. But I would think then that as you are doing that, eventually then we need to start talking about a clean fuel standard, particularly during the transition issue opportunity or transition period of time, and help lower carbon emissions that are not electrified yet.
Thanks, Jim. Brandon.
Yeah, thanks. In the spirit of a couple themes from earlier, which is kind of leveraging the federal spending as well as getting some early wins, and as well as talking about making this action real and educating the public. I think recommendation 5 on public transit, and I would specifically focus on school bus electrification. There's a lot of money in the bill that the bipartisan bill that's already been passed. A large piece of that money is going to be competitive grants. And, having dealt with local school districts over time, the planning that is required to really have a robust vehicle electrification fleet and transition plan when school districts are dealing with, especially right now, given COVID, and especially given what happened in Oxford earlier this week, there's a lot of pressures on school districts to do a lot of different things right now. And so to the extent that the state and utilities and others can really help assist school districts in creating great plans to electrify their bus fleets, I think there's just a lot of short-term potential that we could really leverage in 2022 to get ready to really make a difference in 2023 and beyond.
Right. Thanks. I think that's a great point. And also try to highlight the differences between the urban and rural school districts too, because there's some real practical implementation differences between them. So the planning becomes really, really important. Thanks, Brandon. Peck, and then Niles.
Thanks. I was going to bring up the public transport as well. I think that's a place where we can have an early win, and we might want to even, I know I'm going a little off planning here, but we should think about what are we going to have done by 2030 or 2025 or something. I would love to see us have more electrified public transport around the state. And Brennan just scored big points in my mind by suggesting schools. And that's a way we can really go roll out around the state. And I'll just riff on that to say, what about schools and renewable energy on the schools? It seems like that is a way for schools to have a better revenue stream without the government having to pay for it necessarily. In other words, we give them the loans to build solar on their land. They often have lots of land, or they be part of community solar, and all of a sudden their energy bills go down, and lo and behold, education benefits. So maybe we could find a way to make that work as a group. The other thing I wanted to highlight is charging. I know it's embedded in here, and I apologize I didn't go and reread the report, but we should be more clear that what we want is a build out of a charging network in this state. We want to be the state that really shows that we don't even just build these electrified mobility vehicles, but we have the charging infrastructure that makes it like really fun, and everybody will want to switch over to EVs if they have these charging stations everywhere. But if we don't do that, and we all of a sudden Ford and GM start pumping these cars out, people aren't going to buy them. So let's elevate charging. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Peck. I think Niles, you had your hand up. Are you still wanting to go?
Yeah, no, I was just at this point just echoing what other people have said. I think we're making strides towards achieving a lot of these goals already, and especially around charging stations. As people may or may not know, there's $110 million in a charging station program specifically for Michigan as a result of the IIJA bill. So I think these 5 recommendations, as was already stated, really align well with the direction of the federal and federal government and state transportation departments are going.
Thanks, Niles. Larry Steckelberg from Treasury.
Yeah, Jim referenced the downriver effort, and on Wednesday, the planning group around trying to shoot for an EDA planning grant to help those communities transition met. And this issue of charging our electric buses for the schools specifically did come up from community members. We have a group that are representing the various communities that are generating their ideas of response to the loss of the coal facilities. And I thought it was interesting. I just wanted to put out there that communities are talking about this, and issues were raised such as many of these school districts in the downriver area contract out their busing. So we have a potential there for public-private partnerships with those companies on a mass basis to be efficient and put in charging stations in their locations to meet a sizable fleet of school buses in the downriver area. So I guess I'm just putting on the table, communities are talking about that. And if we get into that space around schools, I think we'll find an engaged group of people who want to help us with that.
Great. Thank you. Want to make sure that Jim, did you have something you wanted to add here?
I just have one other point, and this is probably evident, but I just want to make sure that it's I state this. I think it's important that as we look at the implementation of any recommendation, that is balanced against the two missions of what this council is. One is emission reduction strategy, but the other one, particularly if we're talking about infrastructure build out, EV infrastructure build out, charging build out, this has been talked a lot about in relation to mobility, and that is access for communities that have either are being disproportionately impacted by climate change or economic justice issues, to make sure that all Michiganders have that opportunity for access. And we think about that across the spectrum of what we're doing.
Thanks, Jim. Peck, I'll give you the last word on transport, and then we'll move on to another bucket here.
And Cynthia has a comment.
Sorry, I forgot to take my hand down.
Oh, okay, you're good?
I'm good.
Okay, very good, thanks. Well, let's talk, because we talked about in terms of storage and in terms of renewables at schools. So let's go to the energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage, which is obviously huge for the decarbonization portion of this, and contains all the equity and the other jobs and lots of the other provisions there. So,
Doug.
Yeah.
Before
I think Carrie was saying that Cynthia had her hand up, and she's with being on the phone. Sometimes it's hard.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize, Cynthia. Go right ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sound right.
Okay. No, I just wanted to echo some of the things that folks said. I really do think we need to elevate the charging network, as Peck said. I know it's probably embedded in recommendation 1, but we really need to elevate that. And in terms of our plan, making sure that it's really coordinated with the federal efforts that are going on. There's regulation in terms of EV requirements and baked into the greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards that will be finalized this year for the federal government. So let's leverage those, get the consumer incentives in place as soon as we can, and then roll out the other things. But really appreciate all the comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia. And I apologize for missing you there. Okay. Let's talk about EPTDS. I don't know, Director, do you want to start us again here? And any thoughts here? Nope.
Anybody? Can, but I have confidence that this team's going to want to talk about it.
I do too. It just worked last time, so I thought I might give it a shot. So.
I just drove through the UP in an electric vehicle, so charging infrastructure is in the front of my mind. But I would like to tell you that I made it to Manistee, to Marquette, to Escanaba, and back to Howell. So you can do it. It's not easy though.
A lot of work to do. Yeah, let's talk about it in terms of the energy production, transmission, distribution, storage. Any thoughts that people have along the same discussion on transportation was perfect. So any thoughts along those lines in this section before I call on somebody? Well, let me do that then. Well, okay, I don't have to now. Ron, you go first, and then Darrell.
I'll break the ice on this one. I think as we, I look at recommendation 3, the innovative rate design, really, and underlying that is really as we look at flexible demand response and other opportunities around how we use power and not just looking at the source of power, because I think that is critical to the success of a transition. And so I think that also ties too with, recommendation 3 on the building and housing. So how do we look at the retrofit and the opportunities there to increase that on allowing the different controls and mechanisms for us to create and obviously, avoid what we're already seeing in California and other states with the massive duck turning into a swan, turning into the T-Rex or whatever you want to call it at this stage. But how do we put together a cohesive plan where we recognize and incentivize those opportunities around flexible demand response, virtual batteries, those sort of freebies, if you will, in the sense of creating capacity in the network and around things and allowing that to be done with consumer benefit in the end in a retrofit environment where we know we have a fairly aged built environment. So.
Great. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for kicking us off too. Darrell and then Carrie.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. Obviously all 5 of these recommendations are important, and you can make a case probably for any one of them to go first. But I guess for me, in terms of the bread and butter, that first recommendation is really important, that holistic plan. I think that's how, at least in Michigan, we can really get our arms around what our system looks like. Obviously, we have some systems in place, regulatory systems, IRP process, integrated resource planning processes in place. But in terms of the recommendation, not going through all the details, but it will go a step further and in some ways look at gas as well. And I know there's another recommendation that deals more specifically about winding down the gas system, but I think this one for me would go first, especially as we're trying to get a real handle around our emissions from our energy sector, because I think from all the modeling we've seen, presentation, that's the area we need to go the fastest, and I think having that process in place would be really helpful.
Great. Thanks, Darrell. Carrie and then Brandon.
I'll be snappy. I wanted to just focus on recommendation 1 and 4 from this section. I think in terms of being holistic, I'd also just really encourage the consideration of the ratepayer where their bill is a burden, and really make sure that's integrated into the conversation. Things like community solar and what that could really mean in particular communities. And then recommendation 4, I kind of want to bump up and do that concurrently, because we know that's going to take a lot of work and lift. And if we really want to be able to implement at speed and scale, I think we need to advance that setting conversation in tandem with the education that we've talked about a lot on this call.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Is there a way you think that just while you've got the mic, as a way to jumpstart that siting conversation? Is there a way to do that you like?
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but I think there are some new tools available to us in these modern times. In the spirit of meeting people and community where they are, new ways of communicating. I would just consider employing those as we are trying to reach people and have them understand the economic development opportunity for their community. I'm happy to dive in and get a presentation to anyone who wants it, but that comes from some of my other work.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. Brandon, you got saved by the others because you were the person I was going to call on at the start of this. So I'm glad to see you got your hand up. Go right ahead.
Yeah, and Doug, I also noted Jim had his hand up. Oh, I guess he's put it down. So I don't know if you.
I think that was up from before, but if not, Jim,
okay. Yeah, it was up. It was up from before.
Okay. Go ahead, Brandon.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I agree with Darrell and Carrie and Ron to some degree. It seems like number 1, number 4, and to some degree number 3 are really going to be important and impactful initially to unlocking the clean energy transition here. That planning, that system planning is critical, and you can really at scale have a big impact by thinking through what does this transition look like, so that we can sequence, all right, where do we need to make short-term moves in the 2020s to deliver that net zero system in the long run. So very supportive of that. The siting, I think, is going to be a big concern with in the long run throughout the 2020s. We're seeing that now as we're trying to build out renewables. So that is definitely something that and it gets back to the point we made before. A lot of that is going to be community engagement and talking about the benefits of bringing investment in infrastructure, both to urban and to rural communities, and bringing people along as we do that. But there is always challenges with siting new infrastructure of any sort. And so that is going to be something that we all need to work on. And then pricing, I think, as Ron said, sending the right price signals to consumers, as well as, making sure that as we, continue to invest in the resiliency of the grid, which we're going to need to do in the face of extreme weather, that we have a fair system where all customers, particularly as more behind the meter and distributed energy resources come on, that we, in my mind, we need to move away from the system of volumetric rate design to a different kind of rate design that, adequately and fairly and equitably attributes cost to the bundle of services that the grid provides, whether that's on-peak power when you need it, the wires that can import and export power. The details of that rate design are critically important and can be hotly contested, as we've seen in Michigan and otherwise. But I do think that is going to be really important to this clean energy transition. And so that's, I think, something that we have been weighing in on in Michigan, and we need to continue to try to find a solution in the long run on that. And then on the behind the meter, I guess, and I've said this prior, I do have some concerns about focusing on distributed or behind the meter resources for behind the meter sake. Not all behind the meter technologies are actually zero carbon, particularly in the business sector. There are a lot of natural gas and fossil fuel related behind the meter technologies. And so my thinking is the emphasis should be on cost-effective and achievable decarbonization technologies, kind of in conjunction with that next one about getting energy pricing ready for the 21st century in this clean energy transition. Clearly, behind-the-meter resources are going to play a much bigger role. Customers are going to want them. They can help with the siting concerns that we mentioned earlier. But it seems a little misplaced to just focus on behind-the-meter for behind-the-meter's sake rather than low-carbon, most cost-effective, fair, equitable at scale. So those would be my thoughts.
Hey, thanks, Brandon. Director Clark?
Yeah, I was just going to jump up a level. So some of Brandon's comments go there. And then, so we're talking a lot about what's in these recommendations. I feel like we jumped right into, appropriately, like dynamic rate design and some of the more detailed stuff. I want to go back one level, which I feel like is the overall greening the grid concept, which I think is, in my head, is a little bit of an umbrella to what we were all, some of the detail we were just talking about. The reason I want to bring it up is I feel like it connects to what we heard through energy intensive industries too. So I feel like there were a few, and frankly, if you go to mobility, we don't want to be electrifying if we're not focusing on greening the grid while we're focusing on electrifying, right? So, okay, I'm seeing heads nod. So I just wanted to make sure that with the way I was sort of thinking about it in my head made sense to the rest of you. So it's kind of up one level, but kind of cross cuts. So it's one of those intersectionality things, I think. So carry on. I'm happy with where you're going. I just wanted to make sure that it was okay to think about that piece too.
So greening the grid becomes not only really important early, but also in terms of just the magnitude of it.
And to me, it's kind of like an umbrella piece to like, the dynamic rate design and the mobility pieces and like those but we have to have the greening the grid piece.
Right. For buildings and
I'm sorry,
industry
and I skipped economic development too, right? So one of the regular things that we're hearing in the economic development world is, companies want renewable energy. I mean, the companies that are here say that, the companies that exist in Michigan, the companies that that we're working to retain, the companies that we're interested in attracting, the companies want to purchase renewable energy, as well as, citizens want to see it deployed for public health and other reasons. So, okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thanks. Darrell, and then Phil.
Oh, that was from before.
Oh, okay. Phil.
Yeah, sorry, I really appreciate the director's comment, and I feel like, I don't know where this would go in the plan, but it feels like we need a high level articulation of sequencing here and interdependencies. It's sort of going along the line of what Liesl just said. We got to clean up the grid. Clean up the grid, then that leads to this and that leads to that. And I don't know where that goes, but it feels like in being able to really put in perspective these recommendations and which ones are priority, I think there's sort of 3 or 4 kind of interdependent pieces there that it'd be great if that could be, maybe it's just a contextual statement at the beginning of the plan, that then this would make sense, because you could quickly get lost in the details of this, or I think a casual reader of this certainly would.
Right. No, that's a great point, Phil, because it's all pretty much interdependent at one level or another. So, yeah. Anybody else on this particular one? Any other points that folks would like to make? Tanya.
I always forget I have to unmute after I do that. What comes to mind for me on that energy production piece is, and I think I saw this when that work group did their presentations, but I think there's an aspect of just considering how, like, utility business structures and how we consider the ability to implement some of these pieces, and just really understanding some of the drivers for utilities as a business and how, again, they're helping facilitate this movement to the grid. So I believe that there were some things like performance-based rate making, and I know that's an issue that has been under discussion at the Public Service Commission, but I just want to highlight that because I see that as having an overarching potential impact on how the approach to implementation may occur in this particular topic. So I just wanted to share that, and I'll add to that. I love the idea of doing some mapping around the interdependencies and trying to integrate priorities and then show where some of the different pieces fit together. So thanks.
Right. Thanks, Tanya. Your first point lines up really well with what Brandon was saying about how the system is built on volumetric sales, which may not be the right way to encourage all of the things that you all have listed as being really important to the process here. So yeah, really good point. Anything else on this one? Sam.
Thanks, Doug. I guess I'll take the opportunity.
Sure.
To a certain extent, this may be repetitious from some comment I've made in public or private previously, but just following on other folks sharing their sort of priorities. I think from I'm not so much of an expert in the regulatory process, so again, I defer to others on that, and I think it's super important and super nebulous for me to get through that personally. But from my economics standpoint, there's economic efficiency and there's distributional equity, and those are on equal playing fields for me. And in the efficiency bucket, the most important, the quickest, or the biggest bang for the buck that we get early is taking advantage of economies of scale, is big renewables. And that suggests to me in turn that recommendation 4, facilitate siting of necessary energy infrastructure, is really important. I was a part of a sort of conversation across disciplines and schools at U of M a month ago where the topic was siting, and there were lots of good things shared, but the main the thing that I learned also from touring the biggest solar and a big wind farm array in Michigan. This stuff, there's so much there's intransigence, and there's costs and benefits, and I think we need to have a good process for going through that. That also ensures equity, which then brings me to the second bucket of equity. I think I've been saying this before, that for me, explore innovative rate designs, or in my head, I read that and think narrower than that, explore equitable rate designs, because we currently have, energy burdens are inequitable right now. And everything we do is going to convey costs and benefits to different folks. And the baseline in our economic system is that the benefits tend to be larger for wealthier folks, and the costs tend to be larger for poorer folks. I get that shouldn't. I can imagine that shouldn't necessarily be the top line thing in a net zero report, a net zero carbon report, but it should be, I don't know, basically basically tied for the top. It should come right there with it. And we're always talking about equity not being siloed and not being added on after each category. And to follow on, to build on what Liesl said, Director Clark said, excuse me, what was it that I was? Oh, that mobility and transportation, requires the greening of the grid, and there are rates for, so when we electrify our vehicles, then we're paying for electricity, and so rate design then cuts across in that way as well, and it just seems so important to me, which I want to say out loud because I know that there's been disagreement in the work group previously. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Okay. The Drell made a good point in the chat too, and it's kind of implied in the whole EPTDS recommendations and report, is greening the grid, as the director said. But Drell points out that you've got to have a huge build out of renewables in order to accomplish that, which is, I think, is most of the folks on the call would agree with. I think that's kind of inherent in there, but it's not really said in the 5. So that was a good catch, Darrell. Thanks. How about buildings and housing? Anybody with thoughts on the 5 that are listed there?
I'm going to start off with a here, increase energy efficiency, energy waste reduction. So I just think, to me, that one, there's so much opportunity. I was just in the UP. They were talking about how there's not a lot of new building stock going in, although some in the Sioux around the expansion of the locks. Even just thinking about the UP as an ecosystem, and the work that we did in the UP Energy Task Force, I think helps inform this. But we've got existing building stock that absolutely needs improvement, and that is just such low-hanging fruit that is so incredibly powerful for people. Like, that's a direct people benefit. So I'll stop.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Great place to start us. Carrie.
What Director Clark said. Underline, exclamation point. So one of the great joys of my work life is actually finding these companies in Michigan that are doing this work, and then helping them scale at speed. I think this is an enormous opportunity, and I just really underline the point: the kitchen table, the touch, the feel. To Sam's point, the energy burden. I think this is going to be the most impactful way to engage every citizen on our pathway for this whole plan. So I think there's probably a reason it's in the top left corner, but I would tie recommendations 1 and 4 together, in addition to making our homes healthier and more safe and more affordable, endless amounts of opportunity in workforce, and to grow that industry in Michigan as an export industry. So I'll go on mute, but I love this recommendation.
That's great. Thanks. And there's so much underneath number 1 there. There's so many different ways to attack that, and it really involves, as we were saying earlier, all of the methods, whether it's regulatory, legislative, and others. Peck, you had your hand up for a moment.
Yeah, just for a moment, and then I took it down because I was going to type it instead. But I like very much what Carrie said, and I've been sort of waiting to say, one of the things we're not highlighting enough as an early win is workforce development. We really need to get going on that as quickly as we can. And it's not just for energy efficiency, and it's not just for utility scale and whatever, what do we call it, energy production. But it's also really important to equity and justice. And we should really get on that as early as we can. But as soon as it's another way, if we highlight it as an early win, a lot of people in Michigan would say, oh, this looks like a good thing. Thank you.
And to the director's point too, the existing housing stock that has needs, I think that the work groups did a nice job of also identifying some of those, trying to tie some of the programs together that already exist so that you're not walking away from houses because they've got other code violations and other things. That's a really important step for existing housing. I'm checking the chat here, I'm trying to go back and forth, but okay. Anybody else on the council with comments on buildings and housing? Yeah, Director.
Doug, maybe Susan Corbin from Leo can talk a little bit about her comment in the chat.
Sure, that'd be great.
You don't mind, Susan?
Yeah, I mean, you brought this up, Lisa, that lots of tie-ins on much of the conversation that's going on. But yeah, in the governor's economic vision, My New Economy, she's proposed, $2.1 billion of investments in kind of, the Leo world, things we're keeping track of. And one of the things that she's recommended is $50 million to be used for clean energy investments in Michigan, using the ARPA funds and using existing programs. So the ones that she has talked about are the low-income housing tax credit, property improvement program, and the neighborhood enhancement program. So, and there is information available on that at michigan.gov/my-new-economy. I'll put it in the chat. But I also wanted to mention, in talking about housing, that MISHDA is working on a statewide housing study. Some of you may have participated in that survey. I think it's the most extensive survey that's probably been done in any of our memories. And that report will be coming out early in 2022. So I think we'll probably see some extensive tie-in and opportunities with some of the dialoguing that's going on around, retrofitting and investments in existing housing stock.
Great, thank you, Susan. Any other thoughts on buildings and housing? Darrell.
Thanks, Doug. I guess I would just echo a lot with that other people have talked about in terms of that recommendation 1. I really like it as well. Obviously, we need to increase the amount of energy efficiency. It's proven through numerous studies that some of the best money you can put in terms of getting money back and making people's homes more efficient. We really like the focus on providing additional funding for low income folks as well. So that's also something to be highlighted. But also want to, also point out that electrification recommendation is also really important. So once, and obviously a lot of these recommendations are tied together. So it makes obviously a lot of sense. We're going to be doing electrification, tying it to energy efficiency and clean up the grid. But once people have had that energy efficient home, letting folks, using more efficient ways of heating their homes with electric appliances like heat pumps and those sorts of things. But I think a lot of this is tied to having that workforce. I think that's kind of the dark horse, really important recommendation, because, if we don't have enough folks to do this work, then, all these ambitious goals that we set, we won't even be able to meet if we don't have the man and woman power to do it. So.
Thanks, Darrell. Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. Just quickly, recommendation 2 under buildings and housing is I think a good representative example of the first comment I made when we were discussing thinking about audience and communication. To be clear, I'm not trying to be critical. I think my understanding of building electrification is that we do need more study and consideration. But I think, as Darrell suggested, a lot of people think that building electrification is a must. And I think that right now the challenge is that it's costly, that we need to push that cost curve down. And so in my head, I process that as that recommendation 2 is figure out a way to push that cost curve down. But it's more, it reads more general than that as study and consider. So that's just 2 cents. We don't need to change it. That's just, I wanted to give an example of what I was thinking about earlier.
Yeah. And again, 2, as I read, is kind of tied more to appliances than the electrification of the buildings themselves, but same logic would apply, I think. So, yep. Okay. All right. Anything else on buildings? And I know we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm conscious of time, but how about energy intensive industries? Anyone with any thoughts there?
Okay, I'll kick us off.
Okay.
My big thoughts around energy intensive industries are twofold. One is we heard a lot about greening the grid as a component of that. And then in my mind, we have to continue our work around kind of innovative energy efficiency because it really has such a huge impact there. And the hub was mentioned earlier. And then in the way that I've been thinking about it is largely a bucket of innovation, which can be supported through the state. And I'm hoping we see a lot of investment from our friends at the federal level in order to help us with the innovation component that we can't get through efficiency, through low carbon fuels as an input, and through kind of those steps that were articulated.
Right. And there really is need to explore, because it's really a sector by sector, business by business kind of approach, which will slow things down, but is necessary because steel's not cement and they're not chemical processing. So, Brandon.
Yeah, I agree with Liesl, and I just raise up what Peck said earlier in the conversation about, leveraging federal funding and partnerships to really pilot some interesting technologies in this industrial space. I think could be really impactful for us this decade in Michigan. So I would definitely recommendation 2 about the hubs, and whether that's related to hydrogen or carbon capture or other innovative technologies. I think that's an interesting spot for us to focus on state, given our industrial makeup and frankly our geology, where we might have useful geology for storage of either carbon dioxide or hydrogen.
Is there a lot right now, Brendan, that's kind of left on the table, what could be gotten at with different programs, either through the utility or otherwise, to work with some of the industries?
Yeah, there's a lot coming, so there's been a couple waves of federal funding. There's also, Consumers Energy is a partner in a low carbon resource initiative, which is like an R&D consortium of utilities all around the country. That's also a source of funding. A lot of these early stage pilot things, the challenges are, number one, they're not cost effective today. So you need to find a way to fund this and find willing partners. And you're trying to stand up a number of different partnerships and value streams, which gets back to a theme Liesl has talked about before. You need a lot of different partners coming together. And I think that's a particularly good spot for the state to play a coordinating role, both in coordinating the different industrial and local partners that are needed to make one of these projects happen, as well as then going and advocating in Washington for the funding that, that the federal government can provide to really make this stuff work. So I definitely think there's opportunity there. There's some opportunities now, but there's a lot more coming down the pike. So we should try to get ahead of it.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Peck, and then Jim.
Yeah, and this is as much a question for Brandon as it is for a comment. Since we worked on our university plan, I've just been hearing more and more how one of the big developments that's going to get us through this decarbonization is hydrogen and green hydrogen. And I wonder, should Michigan be trying to position itself? I mean, is this what you were implying in a way? Position itself more aggressively to be a leader in green hydrogen. Mm-hmm. I think that you're right about the geology and the carbon capture, but I don't think that's going to be huge or cost effective compared to green hydrogen. Might turn out to be more cost effective for those things that we cannot just deal with wind and solar and such.
Yeah, Brandon, did you want to respond or?
Yeah, I can react, and Peck, happy to go offline. I know we're running short on time. We have been studying both. I would say we've been doing a lot of work on green hydrogen internally in the economics, and given Michigan's renewable resource capability, we think it's less. We're not the windiest or sunniest state. We think that green hydrogen hubs are more likely to be in areas where you've got high degrees of renewable resource and less energy load. So, think the very windy Great Plains or the deserts of Arizona and things like that, where green hydrogen is really going to come along first. Michigan's makeup is a little bit less conducive to that, but I do think, and that the cost curve needs to come down. So I do think there's a great opportunity for that. I know some of our large corporates that are interested in sustainability are focused on hydrogen because electrification probably doesn't work for some of the processes that they need to decarbonize. So I do think it's a possibility. My own view is that carbon capture, as well as frankly biomass and carbon sequestration, which could produce carbon negative fuels, might be better fits for Michigan than green hydrogen. But I think at this point it's all of the above. We need all these technologies.
Yeah, so that makes perfect sense. And I guess all I'm really, I appreciate your update, is that we should early on be positioning ourselves with whatever winner is the winner for Michigan. And maybe it is the carbon negative fuels, and using our feedlots, and I think that's what you're talking about. So for green natural gas. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peck. Thanks, Brandon. Jim, did you have a comment here? I saw your hand went up.
We're running close on time here. I was just going to add just a little bit more, maybe a coda to what Brandon and some of what Peck's question was. Depending upon what comes out of the Build Back Better plan, there is money targeted DOE grants, a significant amount of increase in money for industrial deployment for decarbonization in grants, and that's an opportunity to leverage federal resources. Once again, depending upon whatever comes out of the Senate. And then in relation to hydrogen, not speaking specifically to color of hydrogen nor specifically to Michigan, but with the build out of significant renewable, you still have to have dependable, committed power. In addition to what you may be able to manage behind the meter kind of thing. And that hydrogen itself is a potential fuel that would currently being used as natural gas for the future in relation to firm committed power. So there's an opportunity on a national scale, and there's a lot of money being invested, DOE particularly, in looking at that. And also in hydrogen production, the NRC is also thinking there's a couple of proposals across the country in relation to what nuclear generation and hydrogen production might be able to use, since that's zero carbon as well. So I just want to add a little bit of flavor to the conversation, thinking about what might be helpful, and industrial carbon reduction, carbon sequestration or utilization on the industrial sector is particularly things in areas like ethanol, as an example, is a pretty easy thing to do. So it depends upon what, where you are at and what kind of emitter it is and how complex that process is. But sequestration is possible, a lot easier on the industrial side than it is on the generation side. That's all.
Right. And with some newly expanded tax credits too in the federal bill, that changes the economics for not everything, but for a lot of different plants.
Significantly, absolutely. Yeah. 45Q, you bet. Yep.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I apologize because I ran us up to the time here, but I do want to at least ask if there are any comments people really want to make on either NWL or on the circular economy or food waste, and I apologize for not giving that more time in our discussion. But let me just ask real quick if anybody has any overriding comments they'd like to make on those two.
I'll just say, I think it kind of helps that we just did that one. So that one's feeling a little fresher.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with us having just a few minutes at the end.
That's why I left them for last, but yeah. Thank you, Susan. Okay, thanks, Director. Again, really great discussion. Really appreciate everybody jumping in on both sets of the discussion here. I think that the idea was to provide a lot for the Eagle folks, and I think you did that. So we really appreciate that very much. And let me turn it back to Director Clark to wrap us up.
You know, Doug, I'm just never going to get used to you not calling me Lisa. Every time I just
Sorry
say,
about that.
No, it's okay. I appreciate it. So great conversation. I really do think that we had some good engagement and back and forth, which helps us with what we need in order to get back to you all. I heard some big themes, certainly around engagement. That was a big theme. I heard a lot around mobility and how it interconnects, certainly greening of the grid or renewable deployment, a lot around energy waste reduction. I guess I kind of think of a bucket around innovation that captures the pieces that are necessary to get us, you know, quote unquote, all the way, that we need to be aware of, that we need to position Michigan well for, and that's not just an innovation, but I'm just talking about it in the innovation bucket for now. But we won't have all the answers, right? But we need to get ready for. So that kind of concept of don't try to predict the future, but instead to try to enable it by having the pieces in the right place so that we can move nimbly. So, so this was a good conversation. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to mention just a few things before we part. The first is that we have moved forward with hiring a new Office of Climate and Energy Director. And so that person will get announced later today. Some of you know Corey Connolly. So we're looking forward to having him come on board. Brandon's shaking his head. And so some of you will not know this, but I've now hired Corey 3 times. Anyway, he's fabulous. It'll be a great addition. Big shoes to fill, and at a really important time to hit the ground running. But he's certainly somebody that I have all the confidence in the world with being able to take those actions. So looking forward to having him on board here before the end of December. So looking forward to action hands. Our next meeting is December 14th at 3 p.m. So Carrie and I will be dragging a little bit. I probably won't have ankle biters, but we do like that 9 o'clock slot, as you can tell. But so we're at 3 o'clock on the 14th. We'll have an outline of a plan in front of you, pulling together what we've heard throughout all of the meetings, but also really focusing on recommendations coming through work groups, and then your digesting of those recommendations and how they interact and what we think makes sense to synthesize it and put it forward in a plan that we would then look at in January. As usual, for those who may have just tuned in, I have to do the commercial. Materials are found at michigan.gov/climate. Comments can always be submitted to eagle-climatesolutions@michigan.gov. Appreciate the council members. Also appreciate folks that have participated in the listening sessions in the last couple of days. And, you know, it is good to have the robust discussion about, you know, back to Joseph's point, you get a lot of solutions from coffee tables, from coffee shops, from being in the right place and engaging with local leaders on the ground. And so that absolutely needs to be part of the work that we do going forward. So I want to acknowledge that too. So I think that's it. And that takes us right up to 11. Thank you for the dialogue and look forward to talking to you in a couple of weeks. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.